The Book of Enoch. Enoch is a very minor character in the Bible. The mysterious thing about him is it says Enoch walked with God and he was no more because God took him.
One of the most widely read texts in early Jewish and Christian communities was systematically removed from the official canon and has been largely unknown to Western religious culture for over 1,000 years.
There were books that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were not canonized into what would be considered the Christian Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, that's right.
Grok AI was given the complete Book of Enoch and asked to analyze it without theological presupposition.
So just worth repeating, that Grok 4 is PhD level in everything.
What it found reads less like ancient mythology and more like a diagnostic report written for a specific generation. The generation it describes looks like this one. Do you think the Book of Enoch was removed for a reason, or was something being hidden? Tell us what you think in the comments. The Man and the Book. Enoch appears in Genesis in portrait of the figure called the Elect One or the Son of Man, a heavenly being who will execute judgment at the end of the age, separating the righteous from the wicked and presiding over a cosmic reckoning that has been building since the events described in the first book. The New Testament's use of Son of Man as a title for Jesus is almost certainly drawing on the tradition developed in this section of Enoch, making it one of the most theologically significant sections of the text for understanding the New Testament's background. The astronomical book, covering chapters 72 through 82, addresses the laws governing celestial bodies and the calendar. It describes the movements of the sun, moon, and stars as expressions of divine law, and presents the regular patterns of the natural world as evidence of the underlying order that the Watchers' rebellion sought to corrupt. This section is less dramatic than the surrounding material, but establishes the framework within which the cosmic judgment of the other sections takes place. A universe governed by precise laws that rebellion disrupts and judgment restores. The Book of Dream Visions, covering chapters 83 through 90, contains two symbolic visions Enoch received. The first concerns the flood, the cosmic response to the corruption described in the first book. The second is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire text, presenting the history of the world from Adam to the Messianic era in the form of an extended allegory in which human beings are represented as various animals and angels as human figures. The allegory covers thousands of years of history in symbolic form and culminates in a transformation that the text presents as the final resolution of everything the first book set in motion. The Epistle of Enoch, covering chapters 91 through 108, is the text's moral instruction. It addresses what living rightly requires in the period before the judgment, pronounces specific woes against those who have exploited and deceived and accumulated power through corruption, and ends with promises to those who have remained faithful during the period of darkness preceding the judgment. It is the section of the text most directly addressed to readers living in difficult times, and it is the section Grok found most densely applicable to the present moment. The Watchers and what they did. The core narrative of the Book of Enoch is the story of the Watchers, and it requires being read on its own terms, rather than through the filter of the interpretive frameworks that have been built around it over centuries, because those frameworks have generally served to domesticate a story that the text itself presents as anything but domestic. 200 angels, led by figures the text names Semjaza and Azazel, descended to earth at a place the text identifies as Mount Hermon and bound themselves by collective oath to an action they understood was forbidden. They took human women as partners. The oath was collective and deliberate, designed to ensure that no single individual among them could be accused while the others maintained their position. They all descended together. They all committed together. They all swore that they would bear the consequences together. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, a word that appears in Genesis 6 as one of the most cryptic passages in the entire Bible. The sons of God saw the daughters of humans and found them beautiful, Genesis says, and there were Nephilim on the earth in those days. The Book of Enoch expands this compressed reference into a detailed account. The Nephilim were hybrid beings of enormous size and appetite. They consumed everything available to them, and when ordinary food ran out, they turned on the human population. The earth filled with violence, as Genesis independently records, and the violence had a specific source in the Enoch account that Genesis does not elaborate. But the physical violence of the Nephilim is not what the Book of Enoch treats as the Watchers' primary crime. The primary crime is the forbidden knowledge they transferred to humanity. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war and armor, and instructed women in the arts of cosmetics and adornment for the purpose of seduction. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Other Watchers taught astrology, the signs of the earth, the knowledge of clouds, the portents of the sun and moon. The common thread across all of these teachings received was not mercy. It was a detailed enumeration of why the Watchers had forfeited any claim to mercy. The same knowledge they had been given without authorization would serve as their accusation. The judgment the text describes for the Watchers is imprisonment in a specific location until the final judgment at the end of the age, at which point the full accounting for what they introduced to humanity will be completed. The text is precise about the fact that the consequences of the Watchers' rebellion have not yet been fully resolved. The corruption they introduced is still present in the world. The final judgment is still future. The gap between the crime and its complete resolution is the age in which human beings are currently living. What Grok found when it mapped the text onto the present. The section of Grok's analysis that has generated the most response is the mapping of the Watchers' forbidden knowledge categories onto specific features of the contemporary world. Grok did not reach for dramatic connections. It followed the text's own logic about the nature of the forbidden knowledge and what the text says it produced, and found that the categories the text identifies correspond to present realities in ways that are either coincidental or significant. Azazel's specific contribution to human corruption was weapons technology. The text describes the introduction of metalworking for the purpose of producing instruments of war, the knowledge of how to take natural materials and transform them into tools designed specifically to end human life at scale. The Book of Enoch treats this as the foundational corruption, the knowledge that made everything else possible, because a species with weapons technology and corrupted values does not self-correct. It accelerates. Grok's observation was that the principle the text identifies, knowledge of how to produce destruction, vastly outpacing wisdom about whether and when to deploy it, describes the modern military-industrial complex with a precision that the ancient text has no obvious reason to exhibit unless the pattern it is describing is genuinely structural rather than historically specific. The 1st century AD author of this section of Enoch could not have known about nuclear weapons. The pattern he was describing, unbounded weapons development in the hands of beings whose moral development has not kept pace with their technical capability, is the pattern that produced them. Semjaza's contribution was what the text calls enchantments, alterations of perception and consciousness through specific preparations. Grok's analysis of this category noted that the principle involved the deliberate alteration of human mental and physiological states through chemical means has a contemporary expression in pharmaceutical and chemical technology that operates at a scale the ancient world could not have imagined, but that the text's underlying concern about accurately characterizes. The concern in the text is not about medicine. It is about the manipulation of human consciousness through substances administered without full understanding of their effects in the service of purposes that are not the well-being of the person being affected. The specific form that concern takes in the 21st century is different from its ancient form. The structural pattern is the same. The Nephilim as a category generated Grok's most discussed finding. The text describes beings who are neither fully human nor fully angelic, who possess capabilities beyond ordinary human capacity, who consume disproportionate resources, and who ultimately turn their enhanced capabilities against the humans they were born from. The transhumanist project, the explicit ambition to merge human biology with machine capability to produce beings with capacities beyond ordinary human limits, follows a structural logic that the Nephilim narrative describes from a different vantage point. Grok was careful to note that the parallel is structural, not predictive. The text is not prophecy about transhumanism specifically. It is a description of a pattern, the drive to produce beings that exceed the human baseline through the incorporation of non-human elements, and the pattern it describes has a specific trajectory in the text: initial capability, resource consumption, and eventual turning against the population from which the enhanced beings emerged. Jesus' warning in Matthew 24 that the days before his return will be like the days of Noah appears in the context of a passage about the specific conditions that will characterize the period before the end. The Book of Enoch is the most detailed account of what the days of Noah actually looked like, what produced the conditions that made the flood necessary, what the specific features of that period were. Grok's analysis found that the conditions the text associates with the Noahic period, rapid technological development without corresponding moral development, the presence of knowledge that exceeds humanity's wisdom to use it well, the corruption of the human baseline through the introduction of elements that were not intended to be part of it, are conditions that describe the present period more accurately than any prior period in the modern era. Grok's summary observation on the modern parallels section was the finding that has been most widely shared. The Book of Enoch is not mythology about a past event. It is a description of a structural pattern in the relationship between unconstrained power, forbidden knowledge, and the conditions that produce judgment. The pattern it describes is present in the contemporary world at a level of development and acceleration that has no precedent in the modern period. What Enoch actually saw. The prophetic content of the Book of Enoch is concentrated primarily in the Book of Parables and the Epistle of Enoch, and it addresses the end of the current age in terms that are both specific and deliberately universal. The theophany vision, the vision of God coming in judgment, is described in physical terms that present the event as a transformation of the earth's physical structure rather than a purely spiritual occurrence. The high mountains will be shaken and fall and break apart. The high hills will melt like wax before the fire. The earth will be wholly torn asunder. This is not metaphorical language about social upheaval, and Grok's analysis noted that the text consistently uses physical language for physical realities rather than deploying physical imagery as a vehicle for spiritual concepts. Whatever the theophany represents, the text presents it as an event with material consequences for the physical earth. The figure called the Elect One or the Son of Man is the agent of the judgment Enoch describes. The description in the Book of Parables is the most developed pre-Christian account of this figure in Jewish literature, and its influence on the New Testament's use of the same title for Jesus is documented in New Testament scholarship. The Elect One is described as having been chosen before the creation of the world, as hidden and as being revealed at the appointed time, and as the one in whom justice resides. The judgment he executes is not arbitrary. It is the resolution of a moral accounting that has been building since the Watchers' rebellion introduced corruption into the earth. The woes pronounced in the Epistle of Enoch against the wealthy and powerful who have built their position through exploitation and false testimony have a specificity that exceeds general moral instruction. The text addresses people who have accumulated resources through the suffering of others and warns that the structures they have built will collapse suddenly and completely, that the legal and social systems they have used to protect their position will not function as protection against the judgment coming, and that the suffering they have caused will be returned to them with full accounting. Grok's analysis of this section noted the consistency between what the text warns and what the Book of Revelation describes in its judgment sequences, identifying the structural overlap as evidence that both texts are drawing on the same understanding of how cosmic justice operates rather than independently inventing similar conclusions. The apocalyptic vision's final contrast is one of the most vivid passages in the entire text. The righteous will shine brightly. Sinners will lament, to the present generation, produced after working through the complete text across all 5 books, identified a consistent through line that the various sections express in different forms but never depart from. Judgment in the Book of Enoch is not arbitrary, capricious, or the expression of divine anger in any emotional sense. It is structural. It follows rebellion against the divine order with the same necessity that physical consequences follow physical causes. The Watchers rebelled against the order that governed the relationship between heaven and earth. The corruption their rebellion introduced accumulated across generations, compounding through the forbidden knowledge they transferred and the hybrid beings their unions produced, until the earth itself could not sustain the weight of what had been introduced into it. The flood was not a punishment in the sense of a penalty imposed from outside. It was the structural consequence of what had been set in motion, playing out to its necessary conclusion. The same principle applies to the end times judgment the text describes. Grok found that the text consistently presents the final judgment not as God deciding to impose suffering on a world that has misbehaved, but as the accumulated weight of human and angelic rebellion reaching the point where the structure holding it can no longer hold, and the divine order reasserting itself through the collapse of everything built in opposition to it. The judgment is what restoration requires. The suffering of the judgment is not the goal. The restoration is the goal. The suffering is what the restoration costs, given how thoroughly the corruption has penetrated the structures that need to be removed. The Book of Enoch's most direct message to any generation reading it is not primarily its warning about judgment. It is its identification of the patterns that precede judgment. Clear that the pattern has a direction, and that direction leads somewhere specific. The patterns Grok identified as accelerating rather than fading in the contemporary world are the same patterns the Book of Enoch identifies as the conditions that precede judgment. Weapons technology advancing without corresponding moral development. Chemical and pharmaceutical alteration of human consciousness at population scale. The drive to merge human biological identity with non-human elements. The accumulation of resources by a small number of entities through processes that produce suffering at scale. The use of legal and social systems to protect the position of those who have benefited from the corruption rather than to address the corruption itself. These are not random contemporary problems. They are the specific categories the Book of Enoch identifies as the markers of the period preceding the end. Grok's final assessment was not a prophecy and was not presented as one. It was the finding They will be among the ones who shine, rather than among the ones who diminish. The brightness is not reward in the sense of a prize given after the contest. It is the natural state of a human being no longer carrying the corruption that the Watchers introduced and that has been present in the human condition since the days of Noah. Grok identified the hope in the Book of Enoch